The story begins with Rick Carver, a real estate broker, being questioned by the police at a crime scene. He was the last person to see Mr. Caldwell, a man who had just taken his own life with a gun. Despite the gravity of the situation, Rick remains composed, casually answering business calls while speaking to the officers. Mr. Carver? Yeah, I'll be with you in a second. After finishing his call, he explains that as soon as Mr. Caldwell saw him, he went inside his house and shot himself. While this may seem suspicious, it is not entirely unexpected. Rick works with banks to handle home foreclosures, and Mr. Caldwell was among the many homeowners about to lose their houses. Rather than facing eviction, he made the tragic decision to end his life. What official statement could possibly capture the cruel absurdity of this situation? Rick, however, shows no emotion while recounting the event, making it clear that he is a cold and ruthless man. We are then introduced to Dennis Nash, a hard-working construction worker and single father, struggling to make ends meet. He is drowning in debt, owing the bank around $80,000. His home is at risk of foreclosure, and his family is on the verge of being evicted. Desperate to save his house, Dennis goes to court with his son, Connor, hoping to negotiate with the bank's representatives. However, the judge only grants him a 30-day appeal period. The bank can have a buyer in place within 30 days. Did you, in fact, miss 3 payments? Dennis pleads for more time, nearly begging, but his words fall on deaf ears. A police officer escorts him out of the courtroom, leaving him feeling frustrated and defeated. As he heads home, disappointment weighs heavily on him, but he does his best to reassure Connor. "I'm not going to lose the home, but how do you know?" Despite his words, Dennis is deeply worried. That night, he frantically searches for a job that could provide enough income to support his family. He scours job listings, makes countless phone calls, and reaches out to everyone he knows, but nothing comes up. Each rejection only adds to his stress and desperation. At this point, Dennis is so broke that he'd probably take a side gig selling pictures of Spider-Man to J. Jonah Jameson. The next day, the situation takes a devastating turn. A group of sheriffs, accompanied by Rick Carver, arrives at Dennis's home. They inform him that the bank has officially taken ownership of the property and that he and his family must vacate immediately. Dennis protests, reminding them that the judge granted him 30 days. However, Rick presents a signed court order that overrides the appeal, making it clear they have no choice. The time has come. You have to leave the property. Rick also reveals that the bank had initially offered them $3,500 as a cash-for-keys settlement, which would have allowed them to leave voluntarily. Since they declined the offer, they now have no time to prepare. Dennis and his mother, Lynn, refuse to leave, leading to a tense confrontation with the police. The officers warn that if they do not cooperate, they will be arrested. Lynn, angry and distraught, insists that the officers are trespassing. However, one of them coldly tells her that she is the one trespassing, as the house now belongs to the bank. With no other option, Dennis and his mother begin packing their belongings, desperately trying to remove everything important before being forced out. Shortly after, Connor returns from school and is devastated to see his family being evicted. He tries to go to his room, but Dennis stops him. Heartbroken and powerless, Connor watches as their home is taken from them. Saying their final goodbyes to their neighbors, Dennis and his family move into a rundown motel. "We'll stay for a while." That night, Dennis makes dozens of phone calls, desperately trying to find work. Later, Dennis gets into a heated argument with a group of movers, accusing them of stealing his construction tools. As tensions rise, Rick Carver unexpectedly arrives, asking what the commotion is about. When Dennis explains, Rick gets a phone call about another issue and prepares to leave. "You've got to be kidding." But before he goes, he turns to Dennis and asks if he's looking for work. Remembering that Dennis mentioned having experience in construction, Rick offers him a small job for $50. Desperate for money, Dennis quickly agrees and follows Rick in his truck. They arrive at a foreclosed home that has been severely damaged by sewage flooding. The stench is unbearable, and most of the workers refuse to clean it. Seeing an opportunity, Dennis negotiates with Rick, saying he will do the job for $250. Rick agrees. Dennis steps inside, only to realize the mess is far worse than he expected. The sticky, foul-smelling sludge makes him gag, and he rushes outside to vomit. The other workers laugh at him, but Dennis doesn't give up. Instead, he offers them drinks and a fair wage to help clean the mess. Reluctantly, they agree. Impressed by Dennis's determination, Rick starts to see potential in him. After completing the job, Dennis returns to the motel and proudly shows his family the money he made. Lynn is thankful, seeing a glimmer of hope. That day they spend a rare moment feeling happy. The next day, Rick calls Dennis to his luxurious mansion to fix an air conditioning unit. Dennis gets a glimpse of Rick's extravagant lifestyle, his massive house, fancy cars, and beautiful wife. However, the constant phone calls filled with angry voices suggest that Rick has made many enemies. After Dennis finishes the repair, Rick takes him for a drive and unexpectedly offers him a well-paying job. "You know what I am? I'm a man who owns a hell of a lot of properties." Without asking for details, Dennis immediately accepts, knowing he needs money to support his family. As they drive through town, they spot a house illegally siphoning electricity and water from a neighboring property. Realizing the house belongs to the bank, Rick turns the car around to investigate. He knocks on the door and confronts the occupant, Frank Green, ordering him to remove the illegal utilities immediately. "So, you're not just stealing from me, you're stealing from the United States government." Frank, though embarrassed, complies with Rick's demand. While removing the extension cords, he confides in Dennis, revealing that their sons go to the same school and that he has seen him at sports events. He also shares that he lost his job 2 years ago and has been drowning in mortgage debt ever since. Before leaving, Frank apologizes, but Rick coldly warns him never to do it again or face serious consequences. Later, Rick and Dennis arrive at an upscale home where Rick instructs Dennis to remove high-end kitchen cabinets and furnishings to be installed in another property. After completing the task, Rick hands Dennis $3,250 and formally invites him to join his company, Rick Carver Realty. Dennis knows he has no other choice. Before pocketing the check, he asks Rick if he can use the money to get his house back. Rick, however, dismisses the idea. There will be time for that later. Rick introduces a new scheme, placing fake tenants in foreclosed homes to collect multiple cash-for-keys settlements from banks, targeting those that pay the highest amounts. Dennis realizes he's sinking deeper into corruption, but at this point, walking away is no longer an option. A few days later, Rick hands Dennis a check for $7,200, his share of their illegal earnings. However, Dennis refuses the money and instead asks Rick to help him get his home back. Without hesitation, Rick agrees to buy the house with his own funds, but warns Dennis that he will still owe him $155,000. Overjoyed at the prospect of reclaiming his home, Dennis thanks Rick. However, something inside him shifts. He straps a gun to his ankle, a weapon Rick had given him for protection. But now, Dennis sees the world differently. Determined to survive in a game rigged for people like Rick, he steels himself for what's ahead. Shortly after, Rick takes Dennis to observe an eviction. A couple with young children, Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, are being forced out of their home. Initially, Dennis remains detached, delivering the news as if it were just another job. "I hate to be here doing this, but I have to ask you to leave the property." However, it becomes clear that Dennis is not built for this kind of brutality. Still, he stands by as the police barge in, repeating the same harsh words they once used on him and his mother. Something inside him cracks. Despite the couple's desperate pleas, Dennis and the police push them out of their home. The experience leaves him shaken. The Tanners refuse his offer to help, calling him disgusting for his participation. It dawns on Dennis that he has become the villain in someone else's life story. Overwhelmed by guilt, he sheds tears for what he has done. Later, Dennis surprises his family by taking them to their old home, revealing that they will be moving back in within a few weeks. Connor is ecstatic, running into his old bedroom. Lynn, while relieved, questions how Dennis managed to make this happen. "The house looks so big." "That's because it is," he replies vaguely, explaining only that his employer bought the house and that he will pay off the debt over time. Deep down, he struggles with the truth, but for that moment, seeing his family happy makes him smile. However, as time passes, the guilt only grows. The more people he evicts, the heavier the burden on his conscience becomes. His breaking point arrives when he forces an elderly couple out of their home, their confusion and distress piercing through him. Despite his internal turmoil, Dennis becomes Rick's most trusted employee. "The paperwork is signed by a judge," Rick assures him. "It's all legal." One day, Rick introduces Dennis to a wealthy investor named Mr. Freeman, who offers them a lucrative deal managing over 1,000 properties. However, there's a condition. Someone must spy on Ortiz, a competing broker selling foreclosed homes. Whispering promises of power, Rick offers Dennis 6% of his profit. After some negotiation, Dennis agrees, realizing this deal will bring him more money than he has ever seen. To sabotage Ortiz, Dennis and a coworker break into several homes he has sold, stealing appliances to make it seem like his deals are crumbling. The next day, during Connor's birthday celebration at a hotel, Dennis's past catches up with him. A man he once evicted recognizes him and angrily confronts him. Dennis tries to ignore him, but the man refuses to back down, blaming Dennis for ruining his life. The encounter escalates into a violent fight, with Lynn and Connor witnessing the chaos. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Dennis lashes out at them, leaving his family heartbroken. Later, when Lynn demands an explanation for why the man knew his name, Dennis snaps. Realizing how far he has fallen, he turns to Rick for guidance once again. Meanwhile, Ortiz's deals collapse as planned, and Rick seizes the opportunity to take control. He offers to replace all the stolen appliances for free, but only if the buyers work with him instead of Ortiz. The scheme works, and Rick and Dennis celebrate their victory at a lavish party. But while Rick revels in their success, Dennis, drunk and consumed by guilt, can only think about getting his home back. Sensing Dennis's frustration, Rick assures him it's just a few more weeks. "You have enough money now to buy any house you want," Rick says. The words resonate with Dennis, and the next day, he impulsively purchases a luxurious mansion. However, instead of excitement, Lynn and Connor are horrified. Lynn scolds him for evicting a family just so they could move in. Disgusted, she threatens to move in with her brother, leaving Dennis devastated. The next morning, Rick orders Dennis to submit a fraudulent legal document to the court to ensure Frank Green, a struggling father, loses his home. If Frank wins his case, Rick's entire deal will fall apart. Dennis arrives at the courthouse and sees Frank with his wife and children, hopeful for justice. Guilt washes over him, but Rick's threats push him forward. Under pressure, Dennis submits the fake motion, sealing Frank's fate. Shortly after, the court rules against Frank, who pleads desperately to the judge, but his cries go unheard. Another family is destroyed by Dennis's actions. That night, Dennis returns to his mansion only to find it empty. Lynn and Connor have left for Tampa. Heartbroken, he drowns his sorrow in alcohol. The next morning, Rick arrives with urgent news. It's time to evict Frank Green. Dennis, feeling hollow, follows him to the scene. However, when they arrive, they find police already there. Frank, armed and distraught, refuses to leave. Tension escalates as officers order him to drop his weapon. Suddenly, Frank fires at the police, forcing them to take cover. In a desperate move, Dennis steps forward and confesses the truth. He forged the legal motion that cost Frank his home. Stunned, Frank lowers his gun slightly. Seizing the moment, officers convince him to surrender, assuring him that his case can be reopened. As Frank is taken into custody, Dennis watches as his wife and children are safely escorted away. In a final act of redemption, Dennis turns himself in and exposes Rick's entire operation to the police. Rick, realizing he has been betrayed, seethes with fury. The authorities move in, and Rick finally faces justice. Meanwhile, Dennis sits in the back of a police car, lost in thought. Just then, Frank's young son approaches the window. Their eyes meet, and instead of anger, the boy's gaze holds something else: gratitude. For the first time, Dennis has told the truth, and because of that, a family has been saved. The movie ends, a powerful reminder of morality, greed, and the devastating cost of the housing crisis.